Hey everyone, this is Louie. Welcome to Disciple Up and our new kind of stripped down version that I've been doing for a few weeks. And pardon my voice, it's a little, I don't know, something started happening with it this morning. It was a little kind of raspy. I'm recording this, by the way, on a Sunday, June 5th, 2022. A little unusual for me. I usually do them on Mondays, but this is the week of Vacation Bible School for this year, so trying to clear the decks of as much as possible, because if you've ever been through Vacation Bible School as an adult who's actually involved in, hang on while I move that, there we go, actually involved in trying to teach it and lead it or whatever it, yeah, it's exhausting. Of course, then all of that, of course, is on top of all the regular things we have to do, and then next Saturday's Tube Float, where I'll be outside in 116-degree temps from 7, well, it won't be 116 at 7, but 7 to noon, so whew, what a week. But, nevertheless, the podcast must roll forward, so here we are in our new little series here called Contact When Faith and Reality Collide, and part 3 here, as we talk about faith and reality, I've titled Looking for an Eternal City. Now, some of you may know where that quote comes from, and we'll be getting to it in just a second. But I would like to just kind of throw this out there, which I kind of throw this out there almost every week. I'm casting my bread on the water. So far it's not returning, but we'll see what happens. And that is, let me know what you think of this series, what you think of this new direction, what you think about what you'd like to hear in the future, what you need to hear in the future, maybe what you don't want to hear in the future. I don't know. Let me know. You can do that simply. Email me, Louie, Louie, at discipleup.org, or you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/discipleup, and leave a comment there. All right, so today we're moving forward, and we want to talk about how faith actually works in our lives and how faith leads us, as the title suggests, to look for an eternal city. That faith, biblical faith now, not just whatever passes for faith in the world, in the culture, is always tied into eternity. So the first thing I think that we need to recognize about faith from Hebrews chapter 11, and that's where we're sort of, is our starting point for this series, and we're going through it because it has a lot to say about faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10, it says, and this, by the way, verse 8 here's one of my favorite verses in the whole New Testament. I don't have a favorite verse, but boy, if I had to pick one, this would be really close. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out. Here's the punchline, not knowing where he was going. Now let me read the rest of this, and then we'll talk about that. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. All right. Let's take verse 8 first of all. God calls all of us to move forward in faith, and we're going to talk a lot about that today, so we'll just slide right past that one right now. And so if I'm going to live by faith, then faith moves me into the unknown, because here's the truth, guys. The truth is that none of us know where we're going. Now, we think we know, and some people, I think it's a very small minority of people, but some people, when they're, say, in high school, maybe college or shortly after college, get this idea for, okay, this is how my life's going to work out. I'm going to do this and that and that and this and this, and it works. And that actually happens. But for most of us, we start off thinking we're going to do this, that, and the other thing, and sometimes some of that happens. Sometimes none of that happens. And in the end, we find ourselves in a place very different than the place that we thought we would be. I mean, I can tell you most of my ministry has taken place in places and in ways that I never dreamed of when I started my ministry. You couldn't have imagined it. By the way, this podcast is part of that, because the idea of a podcast in the 1970s was not a thought you could think, because there was no internet. There was radio shows and stuff, but no internet. So, yeah. So you never know where you're going. And faith always pushes me into that unknown, because faith is about stepping out, holding God by the hand, so to speak, and moving into the unknown, of not being afraid of it, of not trying to avoid it, of not trying to get around it, of not trying to map it out completely before you go and then go. No, this is stepping into the unknown. It's going out not knowing where you're going. And so most of our lives, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, or actually live that way, we just don't know it. Which is one of the odd things about the Christian view of faith is that the Christian view of faith, of course, is that we're saved by faith, and that faith is such a critical and important part of the Christian life. But the real truth is that faith is a part of everyone's life. They just don't know it. And so a lot of people, even though they don't live by faith, they live by fear, they're still being drugged into the unknown. They're just kicking and screaming as they go, which, isn't really helpful. Nevertheless, that's what happens. And so Abraham, it says here, by faith went to live in the land of promise. Like Isaac and Jacob did, right in the same, area that they lived in. And he was looking for something through all of this. He lived his life as a nomad because he was looking for a city, the writer to Hebrews says, that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Abraham wanted to know where God wanted him. He was looking for that place, those people, that situation, and he wouldn't rest until he found it. Abraham was a man of great faith, in spite of all his failings, and he had several. Let's face it, he messed up, we know from the story. Nevertheless, he had great faith. And that's what God wants us to do, is not to be perfect. God knows you're not going to be perfect. God knows you're not perfect now. I think some of us may not know that, but all of us that are honest with ourselves do. But anyway, whether you do or not, God does. He's looking for faith because he knows that faith is how you will grow and become more like him. So faith moves me into the unknown, which means that faith is almost always dealing with things that seem to be impossible. Faith deals with the impossible. Again, Hebrews 11 and 12. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, and even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many of the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Now, the idea of Sarah and Abraham conceiving, with him around the century mark and her not too far behind, it's pretty ridiculous. Let's just face it. And yet God said, don't worry about this. It's going to happen. Just go. So Sarah, even though at first it probably overwhelmed her, and the book of Genesis tells us that Sarah laughed when God said that was going to happen, and who could blame her? I mean, really, how do you hear something like that in your 90s and not laugh? I don't. Wow. Maybe it's because you can't make any sounds at all, but other than that, that's just a monumentally incredible statement. And, of course, it happened. And as the writer points out here, it's not just one child, but from that one man, in Sarah, were born descendants as many as the stars of the heaven and as innumerable as the grains of sand on the seashore. So that's a lot of people. But when you take the descendants of Abraham and Hagar, and then you take the descendants of Abraham and Sarah through the centuries, who knows how many there were. We'll never be able to calculate that. A whole heck of a lot. That's how many. So what seemed to be impossible became possible, and really has impacted the entire world for good and for evil. And that happened because Abraham and Sarah believed, even though it seemed impossible. And if you look at almost any ministry, and you don't have to just look at the big mega churches for this. I mean, you can. It's easy to look at the megas because they're big. So their problems are big, their opportunities are big, and the answers to prayer that God gives them are big. Everything's big, right? So it's like, it's hard to miss because it's big. But if you look at small churches, you'll see the same thing happening. I had this morning a couple of people point something out to me. They asked me a question. In our bulletin, we have a thing on the back that shows you what the budget is for per week for this year, and then what the offering was last week. Now, that does not count the money that comes in online through our PayPal thing on our website, riverchurchparker.com, but it does count what comes into the plate that week. So, and last week, through a series of circumstances and things that had happened and that I obviously can't talk about, we received a substantial, for us, now for a mega church, maybe not, but for us, this was a substantial gift. And when they saw the amount of money that was in that report, they were like, is that a typo? Because, I typed the bulletins up, so they know how bad of a typist I am. And I said, no, that's actually correct. God's, blessing us and being good to us, and we're very grateful for that. Now, if I had set out to raise that amount of money, it wouldn't have happened. But God, working in very mysterious ways and through all kinds of interesting things that I can't tell you about. Maybe someday I will, but it's still, right now, we can't talk about it. He did the impossible. Yeah. And it's major, huge blessing for us. That's for sure. So, that's just, fantastic. And we're obviously very excited about that, and we're thanking God for that. So faith moves me into the unknown, deals with the impossible, but here, now, and that all sounds, in and of itself, that sounds pretty good and exciting to people who are maybe the more adventurous type of people. But now here's something that may not sound as exciting to people, whether you're adventurous or not. Because the second big thing about faith that I need to understand is that faith always demands. When I have faith in God, when I'm following God by faith, God always demands I sacrifice. Always. You cannot follow Jesus without sacrifice. In both the Old and New Testament, we see God calling the men and women who followed him to sacrifice. And the whole Christian life, indeed, is a life of sacrifice. And that's what it is, and that's what it's supposed to be, and that's what it has to be if it's going to be authentic and real and a life that's truly following Christ, because Christ's life was a sacrifice, the whole thing. Again, Hebrews chapter 11. And, of course, I think you know what this is going to refer to. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, notice that the writer to Hebrews points this out. This was a test for Abram. Offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So, yes, the big sort of climax to the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis is this moment when God calls him to take his young son Isaac and go to a mountain where that God will show him. Again, God's always telling Abraham to go places he doesn't know where he's going, and this is one of them. And he takes him there, and he goes up, and he builds the altar, and of course he ties up Isaac, and he puts him on the altar, and he's ready to do this unthinkably horrendous deed. And if you read that passage in Genesis, it uses this phrase several times. My son, my only son, to show you the emotional pathos of this moment, that God here is demanding from Abraham the most beloved and important thing in his life. He's demanding from Abraham the person through which God was going to answer all his promises to Abraham about being a great and mighty nation and descendants as many as the sands of the sea. He's demanding from Abraham the person that God had given him. And see, that's key. God gives us many blessings. But if we're not willing to sacrifice them for him, then those blessings can become a curse, and almost always do. So I have to hold the things that God gives me lightly. Because if he wants them back, I must be willing to offer them up to him and let them go. And the more precious and important to you these things or these people or this one person or this situation or this gift or ability or opportunity or whatever it is, the more important it is to you, the more critical it is that you're willing to let it go to God. And Abraham proved that he had faith because he was ready to finalize that sacrifice before God stopped him. No, God wasn't wanting human sacrifice? Of course not. God condemns that throughout the Old Testament in no uncertain terms. What God wanted was a pure heart devoted to him. He wanted Abraham to make it clear to Abraham that as important as Isaac was to Abraham, Isaac was still number 2, and God was number 1. And so he demanded a sacrifice. He demanded it. And sacrifice, by its very nature, has to cost you something. Now, there's a story in 2 Samuel, again, one of my favorite stories, where David has sinned against God. He did a census, and he wasn't supposed to, and so God is judging Israel now for this, and David goes to God and he says, God, look, I did this. Don't punish my people for what I did. Now, if you're a king or a leader, your people are punished for your mistakes. That's part of the burden of leadership. And God says, all right, you make an offering for me and to me and sacrifice, and this judgment will be over. So he finds this threshing floor that he wants to use for the offering that would later be the site of the temple. And the king goes to the man who owns it, Araunah, and Araunah says, well, look, just take it. Take the threshing floor. Here, I'll bring in everything that you need. I'll bring you the oxen or the animals and everything. I'll do it all, king, just to end this sacrifice, because I love God and I'm a faithful Israelite and I want to help. And in verse 24 of 2 Samuel 24, verses 24 and 25, actually, the king says, no, I insist on paying you for it. Why? Not a pride thing here at all. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. Another massively important statement. And again, another one of those favorite verses of mine. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. Do you see that there? Faith demanded that David sacrifice, not just offer a sacrifice, but that he personally sacrifice something. Now, in Abraham's case, he was willing to give up his son, his only son. Here for David, it took some humility and repentance, and then, he spent a little bit of money to pay for the land and the sacrifices. So it's not like this was probably a big deal to the king of Israel, but it was something. It was something. See, God always demands that sacrifice, because the sacrifice shows me that I'm really putting God first. If I try to make offerings that cost me nothing, then it's not a sacrifice, right? That's why David says, I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing, because they don't mean anything. It's just a religious activity. It's a symbolic act. Sure, you're sacrificing the animals and blah blah blah, but it doesn't actually mean anything if it doesn't cost me something. If it's not in some way, even in some little way like for David, or some huge way like with Abraham, it has to hurt. It has to ding me. It has to be painful. It has to cost me something. And real faith is willing to do that. That's what real faith is about. It's about being willing to answer that demand and sacrifice. Whatever it is that God is calling on you to sacrifice in order to do what God has called you to do. Again, in Abraham's case, of course, he took Isaac and thought that he might have to kill his son, but that God, could always raise him from the dead, or who knows what God's going to do. But if God said to do this, then I'm going to do it, and it doesn't matter what it costs me. Can you imagine the feelings that were going through Abraham's mind, thinking about taking a knife and stabbing his own son in the chest, or cutting his throat, or however he was going to kill him? It's just almost impossible to imagine. That's a sacrifice. David's right. We can't offer to God sacrifices that cost us nothing. And Jesus sort of made that same point when he was talking about offerings to God, that 2 cents for an impoverished person might be a much bigger offering than a whole lot of money from some rich guy to whom that is nothing. So, sacrifice. Faith demands that I sacrifice. And faith demands that I sacrifice my heart's desire. And this is the key to the whole thing. We'll come back to Abraham in a minute, but we're still going through Hebrews 11. And in Hebrews 11, verses 20 through 22, it says this: By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. You see, faith touches the deepest desires of my heart. And faith says these deep, powerful, motivating desires, often given to you by God. I mean, after all, God gave Isaac to Abraham, and God gave Jacob and Esau to Isaac, and on it goes. These things are given to us by God, but oftentimes they can end up being substitutes for God in our hearts unless we're very careful. And so that's why our heart's desires must be given up to God. I must sacrifice them to make sure that they don't take the place of God, that they don't become a little idol in my heart. And so my heart's desires must be sacrificed to God, and not just going through the motions because, I'm going to get it back, so it's okay. No, that's not a real sacrifice. The real sacrifice is I'm willing to give it all no matter what happens, God. And that's why God allowed Abraham to go to that point, to make sure that Abraham understood the depth of his own faith. Because, of course, God knew what Abraham was going to do. He didn't have to show God, but he had to show himself. Now, back to Abraham for a second here. Let's think about this. In Genesis 22, verses 1 and 2, here's the beginning of this story. After these things, God tested Abraham. So there you go. Writer of Hebrews said he was tested. Moses, as he writes this book, says he's tested. And he said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, Wow. Okay. Do you get this? This shows us how important Isaac is to Abraham. And go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham sort of knew where he was going, knew the basic direction, but he didn't know which mountain. God would tell him that later. See, God knew that Isaac was Abraham's heart's desire. Isaac probably knew that. Abraham knew that. Sarah knew that. Everybody knew that. I mean, this is guy's only son, and on top of that, he is the son of the promise. He is the one who's going to bring all these things about. God's going to do it through him. Without him, nothing goes forward. It's like having all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, right? With Isaac, because he's only one kid, and that's it. And now God says, take your son and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. You'll notice God does not explain any of this to Abraham. He doesn't give him a reason for this to happen, which I would certainly be looking for if I was Abraham. No, he just simply says, Abraham, here's what I want you to do. Hop to it. And Abraham does. Pretty incredible when you think about it. He actually just says, okay, and he does it. Abraham, is willing to sacrifice his heart's desire. Wow. I'm just, every time I think about this passage, that amount of faith and trust in God's just amazing to me and moving to me. And it also makes me reflect on my own faith and realize, I don't think I have that amount of faith. I don't think I have Abraham's faith. Not yet. Could be wrong, but I don't think so. I mean, God's called me to sacrifice a lot of things in my life. Of course, everyone does who follows Jesus. It's not like I'm some big special case or a martyr, or that you should feel sorry for me or think, oh, he's so spiritual. He's given up things for God. Oh, yeah, big deal. Everybody has. That follows Jesus. But, wow, something like that's you'll pardon the pun here, that's a pretty steep mountain to climb. And yet Abraham does it. So that's just absolutely incredible. But that's what faith does. It demands your heart's desire. So what's most important to you? If you had to list the 3 most important things and or people in your lives today, what would you write down? In fact, take a second right now, if you're somewhere where you can do this, and write them down. Now, sometimes it's really, really hard, right? Because if you're putting your children down, then it might really be hard to say, okay, this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3. But, your kids are probably not there, so go ahead. You probably have a favorite. But seriously, would you just be willing to sacrifice that child, to give that child up? And you think, well, I don't have to worry about God telling me to go up, take him up on a mountain and stab him in the heart. No, you're right, you don't. But here's what you do have to worry about. What if God calls you to take a step in your spiritual life, get involved in a deeper way in ministry or serving God, and your husband, your wife, your child, your grandchild, whoever, doesn't understand that and thinks you're nuts? Are you willing to incur their displeasure to serve God? Or when they say they don't want you to do it, are you going to fold? See, that brings this whole discussion of Abraham and Isaac and the hillside and the knife and all that, that brings it down to reality, doesn't it? Yeah, that does. Those are the real life situations we run into. If you're single out there, you fall in love with someone and everything's looking great, but they don't want you to be involved in the ministry that you really believe God has called you into and that maybe you're serving in now or you're about to go into, are you going to go along with them so that you can marry them and be, quote, happy, unquote, or are you going to do what God's called you to do? I know a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, who I graduated Bible college with, and other people who I didn't graduate with but I know of, who have left the ministry because their spouse put the foot down and said, that's enough. Had enough of this crap. Pardon my language, but, it's being in full-time ministry is not easy. It's hard, depending on the churches that you end up in, and the way people treat you sometimes is pretty bad, and it can also, by the way, really undermine your faith. And being involved in a volunteer ministry in any way can do the same thing if you're not careful. And I know a lot of people who felt God called them into ministry that didn't go, or who left it because their spouse and or their parents and or other people applied the pressure, and it got to be too much, and they bailed. That's the kind of real-life sacrifices we have to make today. You willing to do it? Here's the thing about that question is you can't answer it honestly now. You can say, well, sure, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay, that's fine. But you're never going to know until the time comes. That's when you find out you're willing to sacrifice, when you actually have to do it, not when it's theoretical. And some of you may be in a situation right now where it is real, where you're tussling with people. You feel God does want you to do this, and the opportunity's there, and you're prepared and everything else, and they don't want you to, and you're wavering back and forth. Just remember this. Faith always calls me to sacrifice, and it calls me to sacrifice my heart's desire. Let me tell you, before we move on, a story that I've told before. It's a true story about my own life. When I was in high school, I became a Christian. Now, my dad was not the kind of guy you could talk to about God at all. I didn't know all this at the time, but he had gone through some terrible. He didn't have his mother was one of those people that would drag people from church to church to church trying to find, quote, the perfect church, unquote, and never found it, obviously. And then he went off to war, World War II, and he saw the horrors of war, and he saw all these godly people dying, and people like him who were not so godly not dying, and all these terrible things that men do to each other in war. And so he came home from that, and he just didn't, he wasn't going to talk to anybody about this God stuff. He was out as far as he was concerned. Well, so we went to church when I was a little boy because Mom took us. Dad did not go. And then we quit when we moved out from Indiana to Arizona. Then we started going back, and in high school I accepted Christ, and I got involved in the youth group and everything else, and everything was kind of okay. He wasn't really too concerned about all that until the day I came home and dropped an atomic bomb in the living room. Now, I have two older sisters, and the middle sister, Monica, had done this a year or two before, like a year and a half, when she said she wanted to go into full-time Christian service, maybe a missionary or whatever. That didn't go over well, and I mocked her for that because I wasn't a Christian at that point. I wasn't saved. So then it was my turn, and I told Dad I wanted to go into full-time Christian service and be a minister or a missionary, or I didn't know what, but I wanted to do something, and holy cow, he came unglued because, of course, he was like most World War II vets. One of their big dreams was that their children would do better than them, and so they wanted you to go to college because in their generation, that was how you got ahead. It's not so true anymore, depending on what field you're in. Some fields it is, some fields it isn't, and he absolutely blew his gasket. And he would not speak to me for at least a week or two. And things were very tense around the house. And he was, at that time, going out Monday through Friday. He'd be out of town most weeks working for the Bell Company. He worked for the Bell system before they broke it up. And he went up to Prescott, and he was gone for a week, and he came back, and he called me in, and he said, Louie, I was up there, and I saw all these kids. There was apparently some big hippie gathering up there. Yes, these were real hippies, folks, back in the 1960s hippies. And he was just appalled, the drug use, and they were just obviously all messed up. And he said, I think these kids need somebody that can reach them in your generation, and you can do that. So, I'm okay with your decision. So that was great. But, there was a period of time there where the pressure was intense to back down, and the pain of your own dad not speaking to you, and things like that. And some of you have been through a lot worse than that. But that's just an example of what I'm trying to say is, are you willing to bear that price to follow God? Because if you're not, then your faith needs to be strengthened and it needs to grow. So faith always moves me into the unknown, and faith always demands that I sacrifice, and that sacrifice will always be my heart's desire, whatever that may be at any given moment, because those things change. And then finally, faith always focuses me on what's beyond this world. Yes, I pay attention to what's in this world, but obviously I'm ministering to people and they're in the world. But I'm also focused on what's beyond this world. Because faith, as we said at the beginning, like Abraham's, looking for that eternal city. Faith, biblical faith now, is focused on what's going on in eternity. And when I minister to people and I help people, I always have eternity in mind. And I'm hoping that I can help them for eternity, because that's part of what faith is all about. So, look at this. Hebrews 11, 13 to 15. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. If you're reading this in your own Bible, or if you have your own Bible handy, you should probably underline, circle, mark that somehow. Strangers and exiles on earth, we'll come back to it. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. And then we'll get to that final verse 16 in just a second. But let's take a look at this. The Old Testament saints, that's who he's talking about here, all died in faith. And they didn't get what they were promised. But they had seen them by faith. They had seen them. They knew God was doing something. They knew it was going to be eternal. They knew it was going to be beyond their even ability to comprehend. So they didn't really comprehend it, I'm sure, but they knew it was there. And then it says, having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Now this morning, June 5th, 2022, I preached on developing a biblical worldview, part of my new series called Shift. And part of developing a biblical worldview is recognizing that we are strangers and exiles on earth. We're strangers because we're strange to the world because we don't have their values. We share some of them, but as our culture continues to, at this point I can only say disintegrate, we're going to share it less and less and less in common with them. And exiles, eventually they're going to push us to the margins of the culture. They're going to push us out and away from them because we are going to become not just annoying and convicting, but we are going to become offensive to them. If you don't believe me, just go to some regular meeting somewhere of just regular bunch of people and just, say that, yeah, there's only two genders, men and women, and you're born that way, and that's the way you will always be because your DNA and your skeleton structure and your body chemistry can't be changed, at least not apart from doing great damage to your body. And watch what happens. If there's very many people there, especially younger people, they will be offended. So we are going to be exiled. Not maybe literally, sent out in a caravan to the middle of the desert. It's okay if they do that to me because I live in the middle of the desert. But for those of you that don't, come on out. It's going to be 117 Saturday. You're going to love it. But seriously, this is what it means to walk by faith. And it's okay to be a stranger and an exile in this life because my focus isn't just this life anyway. My focus is the next life. Now, this is an area where I think modern American Christianity has really fallen short. One of the things that I noticed almost right away when I started traveling overseas was how people living in the third world, the Christians there, focused a lot more on heaven than we do. Maybe that was because their earthly life isn't so good. And it isn't so long either. And so they're not as wrapped up in all the things that we're wrapped up in this life. Obviously they are, but the extent to which they're wrapped up isn't as great, and they do have a definite desire to move on to that next world that you don't see in a lot of Christians in the United States of America. Because our faith has been kind of, it's been very grounded, which is a good thing, but maybe let's just take the maybe off that. But we've done too much of that, and I'm guilty of that in my own teaching, because I'm like extremely practical and very pragmatic, which is fine, but we can never forget that we are strangers and exiles on the earth, and that there's a better homeland. There's an eternal city waiting for me, and I'll be there soon enough, no matter how old or young you may be. And so faith always focuses me on what's beyond this world, what's beyond time, what's beyond all of this. And as a part of that, faith leads me to focus on better things. Faith leads me to focus on better things. Now, here's verse 16 of Hebrews 11. They just said, if they'd been thinking of that land from which they'd gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. Now, verse 16. But as it is, they desire, and notice, by the way, he writes this in the present tense, which is very interesting. He doesn't say they desired. He says they desire, because in the mind of the writer of the Hebrews, it's like they're alive. He's so into their story. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is, a heavenly one. Therefore, based on everything I've just told you, the following is true. God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So that city that Abraham was looking for, which is whose foundations, the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God, that city is being built by God for us right now. In fact, it's already built. It says he prepared. It's there, and God wants us to step into it and to look forward to it. And faith leads me to think about that. So when things get really bad here, and here's the important part about this, from a practical perspective. When you believe that God's got a better life for you in the next world, in the next life, however you want to say it, after you die, after you depart this earth, after your body assumes room temperature, after you croak, kick the bucket, whatever you want to say, it helps you endure the things in this world that are bad, because that's when you remember, because faith focuses on eternity, that no matter how long this lasts, it's only the merest, teeniest, tiniest fragment of a moment of eternity, and it's not even that much. So no matter how bad things are, no matter how much pain and suffering I'm going through here and now, what do I know? I know that in the next life, things are going to be so amazing and so blessed that all this it's going to be nothing. It's just not going to be important. And you're going to be able to look back on it in a whole different way. And isn't that how we live our lives? We go through tough times when we're younger. When you look back on them as an older adult, you kind of think, well, at the time, that was like a big deal when I was in high school and this happened. But now, as an adult, I look back on it and I think, well, that wasn't really a big problem. I've got big problems now. But then when you get older, you're going to look back on these and you might think the same thing, and on it goes. So this is just another step in that process where when we are with God in heaven, we're going to look at our whole lives here and realize how small and how compressed and how limited and how quick it was. I think one of the things about aging, because you'll hear old people like me all the time, and older and younger, talk about how fast life goes, and it's like, boom, I mean, here we are, it's June of 2022. The year's almost half over. What the heck happened, But if you live by faith, you have to think, well, yeah, that's the way everything is, because that's the way it actually really is. Because a year or 50 years or 100 years is nothing in the time span of eternity, because eternity doesn't have a time span. That's the problem now. English, any language, fails when you talk about eternity, because you can't talk about it because if time does not exist in eternity, then you can't measure eternity, because that's what time is. It's a measure of our experiences on this earth. And if time doesn't exist, then I don't, if there's a way to do that, we don't know about it. Maybe there is. We'll find out. The important point is that faith leads me to understand that no matter how bad things are in this life, God has better things for me, both here and there. And that's where my focus is, and that's my motivator, and that's where I draw my hope from what God is doing and is going to do. And I don't let life tear me up or get me down, because faith has pushed me into the unknown, helped me overcome the impossible, helps me to make the sacrifices I need to make. God demands these sacrifices not because he needs them. I need them, we need them, you need them. And I must give him my heart's desire to purify my heart, to look beyond this world to the better things God has. And that's part 3 of When Faith and Reality Collide, looking for an eternal city. I hope this podcast was a blessing to you and it helped. If it is, please get a hold of me and let me know. You can email me, Louie, Louie, at discipleup.org. Go to our Facebook page if you got Facebook, facebook.com/discipleup. You can leave a comment there, and or if you know me, you can just talk to me, because I'd love to know about that. And if you got any thoughts or feelings about where we go in the future, let me know. Till next time, this is Louie, thanking you so much for listening. God bless you. Please tell somebody about this podcast. Show them how to listen to it, and encourage them to do so. And until next time, remember, every time is a good time to disciple up. So long.